The roundtable discussion highlighted that downside risks have increased significantly since the beginning of the year. There has been increasing global uncertainty driven by trade wars as well as geopolitics. This has seen growth projections being revised downwards. Slowing global economic growth leads to slowing demand for commodities, posing a serious threat for economies reliant on commodity income.
There are certain aspects that then become quite significant for resource-intensive economies, because slowing global demand also leads to slowing demand for commodities, and especially for economies that borrow, low-income economies that borrow in foreign currency.
Delegates heard that the global debt landscape reveals a grim picture where 9 economies are currently in debt distress, all of them low-income economies. Chief of Staff for the Deputy Finance Minister, Jordan Griffiths, stressed that South Africa is not in a debt trap. Government debt is at 77.4% of GDP in this financial year, the highest since the dawn of democracy. Debt service costs are expected to take 22 cents out of every R1 collected in revenue, or 1.2 billion rand every day, thereby curbing government spending on its public priorities.
Africa, in terms of debt and the country, what I can say is this, is that in National Treasury, there is a firm eye on the debt to GDP ratio. And there is a deep desire to stop it from going higher. There is a deep desire to do that. We are introducing fiscal anchors and fiscal rules in order to try and force a stop and flag when government spending is going to become unsustainable. And there are some green shoots about how these are very real discussions. You would have seen the entire fight about VAT, which forced an entire realignment in the way in which the budget was done. 3 budgets in the end were created, which speaks to a level of accountability and thinking in terms of how we're going to frame our fiscal policy going forward. And manage our government spending downwards.
A former director of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka, Dr. Roshan Perera, offered lessons from Sri Lanka's debt crisis. She says while debt is important for development, it should be used for the right purposes to grow economies. She highlighted that despite 16 IMF programs, successive governments failed to correct fundamental imbalances, ultimately leading to disaster. Perera says good governance structures are key to put a lid on misuse of resources and promoting accountability.
I think governance was kind of the root cause of the economic crisis in Sri Lanka, because governments were not held accountable for particularly of the debt that they raised. So I think politics played a huge role in that sense, because there was no transparency in terms of the debt that was raised and how this debt was used. So the governance part is, I think, a huge part of this whole process, and that's what I'm saying. So if going forward, basically, if you want to prevent Sri Lanka going back for the 18th time into this IMF program, we need to strengthen these governance structures.
There were also concerns raised about perception premiums assigned by credit rating agencies, which may unfairly penalize developing economies, especially in Africa.
There's been some really interesting studies done most recently by the UN Development Programme, the UNDP, on the fact that the way in which credit rating agencies rate African economies, where they factor in a risk premium for all sorts of reasons, and we can go into them now, has actually cost these economies up to about $74 billion more than what other countries might be paying for the same loans, for the same borrowing. And part of that relates really to the perceptions of African countries. We've had a lot of conversations. We've heard more recently around the role of credit rating agencies in that regard, the fact that the methodologies and also the time spent in the field by credit rating agencies is not sufficient to get a much more nuanced picture of what is happening in the country.
To address the challenges of high debt to avoid a debt trap, it is recommended that there be debt sustainability frameworks to support developing economies before they reach unsustainable debt levels, addressing illicit financial flows, enhancing transparency in debt reporting, and prioritizing domestic debt markets to reduce reliance on external borrowing. Gloria Sefako Mosi, SABC News, Johannesburg.